Good evening. China's war of punishment against Vietnam seems about to heat up or about to cool down, depending on who is believed, on how conflicting signals are read. In the last 24 hours, China said its troops are now out of Vietnam. Its 26-day war to punish Vietnam for invading Cambodia is over. Vietnam said that's not so, that Chinese troops were still there, killing people and looting and destroying villages and towns. This was accompanied by a New York Times report that Soviet planes and ships are involved in a major movement of Vietnamese troops and equipment up toward the Chinese border, raising the possibility that Vietnam may be considering a punishment counterattack of its own. And to complete the confusion mix, both sides repeated their willingness to begin peace talks, the Vietnamese said as early as next week. Tonight, with a special film report from inside Vietnam, a look at the struggle between these two communist countries and the United States' stake in it. Robert McNeil is off. Charlene Hunter-Gault is in New York. Charlene?
Jim, a curious mixture of secrecy and hyperbole has made it extremely difficult to get a clear picture of what's been going on in this conflict. With us tonight, however, with his filmed report is Michael McClear, a 20-year veteran foreign correspondent for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Mr. McClear was in Vietnam for 6 weeks before and during the conflict. He had also made 3 previous trips since 1969. The first part of his report includes footage obtained from the Chinese, their perspective of the invasion. That's followed by a reaction from the Vietnamese. Then Mr. McClear steps back for a closer look at the issues leading up to the invasion and the mood that followed.
Frenzied provocation and hostilities of the Vietnamese authorities resulted in the grave situation along the Sino-Vietnamese border. There was a limit to China's forbearance. China was forced to strike back.
And right back at you, vows Vietnam's Prime Minister to Politburo applause. And they laugh as he says, someone wants to teach Vietnam a lesson, but we'll teach this lesson. And says, tell it to the world. But world diplomacy froze over Cambodia. Sam Van Dong, Defense Minister General Giap, Party Chief Les Duan, had ordered one invasion. Clearly, China was retaliating for its Cambodia defeat a month earlier. Clearly, the street dugout showed that Vietnam expected the invasion. Clearly, the Chinese were to be allowed in. But China didn't or couldn't advance very fast. In Langzong, just 10 miles from the border, the casual civilian evacuation lasted several days. Just as casually, troops headed north, most foot-slogging into the hills to encircle evacuated towns. Partly this was ancient tactics to avoid entrapment in the now-abandoned towns. But mainly Hanoi and Moscow were avoiding, they said, a potential Holocaust, which they feel China will again risk if the West continues to equate the two invasions. Clearly, China didn't achieve much this round. That could mean danger ahead.
Certainly, as you can hear, we can hear the artillery firing, but it's intermittent, and there are more press and troops on the road at the moment.
The press tended to score it even, which means it could escalate even more. History suggests it. While Dong Dang, the nearest border town, fell, here on a Hanoi hill called Dong Da, the Vietnamese were celebrating victory over China in 1789. Then, as now, it was really eyeball to eyeball. There was day-long matching of muscle on the battle site, and speeches about Chinese defeats in the 13th, 15th, and 18th centuries. And now they're told China must also wrestle Russia. So, confidently, they reenact Vietnam's last rout of China.
This drama of that long-ago Chinese defeat is being presented to an invited diplomatic audience of Soviet and East Europeans who, of course, have more than a musical interest in the current border conflict.
It's a Beauty and the Beast tale, how a lady general rallied popular resistance. History does record the victory, though not the lady. But with the Soviets' reassurance, the finale has 200,000 Chinese running from a wound. Vietnam's mood pre-invasion appears in retrospect significant. Of course, the public needed reprieve after Cambodia. Yet the whole nation, the whole army, it seemed, was kept on R&R. And though the Soviets stood out everywhere like security guards, Vietnam had essentially disarmed. While its soldiers played, Vietnam reported ever-increasing Chinese incursions. Foreigners were told during Tet that China had massed 25 divisions, but no one believed it. The atmosphere belied it. In retrospect, Vietnam was avoiding any move. It wasn't fighting from choice, it hadn't been. That was the message. It had been drawn by China into Cambodia and was now to be blooded again. Aware of the coming Tet Offensive, Vietnam assumed a self-punishing, do-nothing policy. Perhaps it was a gesture, perhaps inertia. Perhaps a confused country, traditional prayers, nationalism negating Marxism, young as well as old adhering to ancestor worship. What motivates them? Traditions or ideology? What ultimate objective? True independence or to be the Cuba of the East? Certainly a puzzle. Prayers at a shrine to those who defeated China. Here, symbolically, a Russian places incense sticks. Yet Moscow and Hanoi held back from war, and possibly Washington's pro-Peking policy did more to ignite the invasion. Premier Pham Van Dong foresaw this.
Do you at all fear that Sino-US relations, which are improving, might be an encouragement for China to act against Vietnam?
We remain highly vigilant. The Vietnamese people, having gone through many trials, are used to being ready to cope with all contingencies. It has been significantly borne out by our history.
Noon invasion day. They were indeed used to war. They didn't blink. Each midday in Hanoi, they play the Ho Chi Minh song. This day, there was nothing more martial. No alerts, no blackouts, no curfews. Only a few red banners to proclaim invasion by a billion fellow communists. We've witnessed the pre-invasion mood. What would change? Could they, as the Prime Minister said, cope? Not so well. The invasion had lasted too long for any belief in peace, and peace had been hard enough.
A straw hut society which could easily rise from the rubble of the bombing can't so easily rise to peacetime expectations. And here we get some measure of the problems and the pace of things. Hanoi's population has grown by 1 million. But this complex of 24 apartments will house just 1,900 families and has already taken 7 years to build. We're told there are 700 workers on the site, though I've seen perhaps 70 of them. Hanoi has plans, but it is lacking in technical and raw materials. Above all, it is missing the old muscle.
Officially, the labor force is, quote, underutilized, meaning there's much idleness caused by shortages and confusion. Now, national reconstruction has been further slowed, and the switch from peacetime priorities will be more damaging than anything felt on the battlefield. Here are the debris of a decade of war. Tanks, jeeps, guns, shells, 100 tons of it dumped here every day. All this hard-hit hardware, acres and acres of it, is now to be reshaped much as it was. This steel reprocessing plant atUen Hoa is Vietnam's biggest. Now it's mobilizing American hot rods against China. It has switched to war production, quote, indefinitely. Old U.S. war material had fed the plant for 4 years, and there's still enough, they say, for another 4. But now it's swords into swords. An AK is part of everyone's IQ in the north, but not here in Saigon, as everyone calls it. Here civilians are having to be shown just how a rifle works. How cohesive is the new Vietnam? The new conflict raises serious questions, socially, militarily. Outside the former presidential palace in what's now Ho Chi Minh City, police of the old regime get much-needed basic training in sniping and cover tactics. If Vietnam can cope, it will be doubly tough. But today it is still two halves in at least 2 respects. Here in Saigon, they've modern facilities but lack fighting ability. It's the reverse in the north, where the main port, Haiphong, is still in serious disrepair 4 years after the B-52 bombing, looking in parts as if it had just been bombed. Ships often wait weeks to unload, while cargo piles up chaotically. Some of it, we learned, had been here 2 months. These scenes were filmed well after the invasion. Little evidence that the $1 billion in East Bloc aid is getting through. If fighting resumes, only a massive Soviet airlift could assist Vietnam, that or direct Soviet intervention. That factor, and Vietnam's current all-out mobilization, may in future deter China. May do. But the result, perhaps intent of China's invasion, has been to push Hanoi into Moscow's arms, and so push Asia into a prolonged proxy contest of arms. It seems Peking has exploited Washington's friendship to achieve opposite ends, to harden the battle lines. Vietnam's premier calls U.S. policy inconsistent, saying U.S.-Vietnamese diplomatic ties would help stabilize the region.
Vietnamese and U.S. talks on normalization had once, not long ago, almost achieved good results. But recently, the United States changed its mind. They speak one way and do otherwise, and show a changing and inconsistent attitude. In this matter, normalization, lack of progress, is due to the U.S. side.
You feel the Cambodian issue has delayed the coming together of the U.S. and Vietnam relations, perhaps for a long, long time?
If they want to delay things, that is a pretext for them to do so.
Talking for 2 hours, Pham Van Dong repeatedly told me Vietnam would treasure American friendship. And indeed, stability in Asia and all across our Pacific frontier may depend on the Americans returning to Vietnam as friends. Officially now, it's back to protracted war. In the building where he planned the victory over Saigon, Chief of Staff General Van Tien Dung told me, a week after the invasion, his assessment.
Their final aim is to conquer our land, but they cannot do it. They should remember the French and U.S. wars. The Chinese army is not as strong an army as that of the U.S. The Chinese have to stay at the level they're at. We are prepared for a long war.
Mr. McClear, do the remarks by General Van Tien Dung suggest that he feels China isn't really going to withdraw totally from Vietnam?
Hanoi has no belief in Chinese withdrawal because it doesn't believe in the original motivation of Peking's professed punishment, that it was for border harassment. And indeed, it's, unless it's pointed out, the public would tend to forget that along the border, the Vietnamese-Chinese border, there have been only really very few deaths over a great many months, and the most serious incident both sides admitted to was last August when just 2 people died. Now, 6 months later, China invades. So is it really for border harassment? No. As Hanoi and Moscow see it, it's clearly punishment for the proxy war in Cambodia, which China lost, and therefore that proxy war will be renewed in one form or one arena or other.
Well, how do you read today's reports that the Soviets are moving massive numbers of Vietnamese troops to the northern borders?
Well, my film report...
retaliation?
My film report projected that this would happen if the situation became serious or was taken seriously because of the economic and communications mess.
Does that suggest that you think China is going to now invade?
Well, it's what they feel.
I mean, Vietnam is going to now invade China.
Do I feel Vietnam is going to invade China? No, it's hardly likely. There may be border incursions, there may be some effort at reprisals, but as Hanoi and Moscow see it, the war will shift again to Cambodia, so that the Soviet airlift that's reported taking place would be a movement of troops from South Vietnam into Cambodia, or from troops in Saigon to the north, perhaps to meet a new contingency in Laos. Early in the days of the Chinese invasion, the Soviets warned Peking very strongly, keep out of Laos. Now, whether it's true or not, we're getting reports that Chinese forces have, I wouldn't say invaded, but infiltrated into Laos.
In your film, you reported that everyone, including the U.S. and Vietnamese, were warned of the Chinese invasion coming up. Did you get any sense from the Vietnamese when you were there that they felt the United States could have done anything to prevent the incursion?
Well, the Vietnamese, as I see it, were sending every signal, and there were a great many signals, that they feared this situation, that they had no desire for it, that they wanted to adopt a moderate posture and stabilize the region.
And wanted the U.S. to come in.
And wanted normalization with
All
the
right.
U.S. Now, if I can just make the point, that question of whether the signals were missed or ignored remains urgent because the situation remains urgent.
All right, we'll come back. Thank you. Jim?
All right, now for the official U.S. view of what's happening from Jack Cannon of the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. First, Mr. Cannon, do you have any late information or guesses even on what Vietnam may be planning in terms of moving those troops to the north?
No, Jim, we do not. We have seen the press reports that you have, but we have no indication that the Vietnamese are planning any kind of counterattack.
All right, now to the point that Mike McClear just made, and also the film made, that the United States, at least from a Vietnam point of view, is partly held responsible for this Chinese invasion. What's our view of that?
I think it's utterly simplistic. The Chinese were acting entirely on their own. We were entirely opposed to the Chinese invasion of Vietnam, as we were totally opposed to Vietnam's sending more than 100,000 forces into Cambodia. We exercised every public and private effort, and we continue to do so, to bring this conflict to a close. But it is just wrong to suggest that we could have had leverage with the Chinese, or in fact with the Vietnamese. If we had more leverage, we would have used it.
Did we miss any signals from the Vietnamese?
Not that we're aware of. We are still urging that the Vietnamese leave Cambodia, as totally reprehensible as we consider the Pol Pot regime to be. We consider Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia to be a total violation of the principle of territorial sovereignty, and it is just wrong. We've urged them to get out. We've urged the Chinese to get out of Vietnam. Our chief concern is a wider engagement. We feel that's a very serious concern. We're doing everything we can to prevent it.
Was the Vietnamese premier right when he said on that film to Mike that the invasion of Cambodia put or in some way inhibited the push toward normalization with Vietnam?
No, I think that the question concerning what was presented to the United States in November and early December was that we were looking at a growingly serious situation in Southeast Asia. It became clear that the Vietnamese were preparing a massive invasion of Cambodia. We also had a very serious situation with enormous persecution of Chinese refugees who were outflowing from Vietnam. We told the Vietnamese publicly and privately that these matters would be taken under serious consideration when the United States was considering the pace and timing of normalization of relations. The Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia continued. The refugee situation continued. We have taken the matter under account, and under the present circumstances, we don't see presently or currently a resumption of these normalization talks.
They're just stopped right now.
Yes.
And they're not going to begin again until Vietnam gets out of Cambodia?
We are constantly reviewing our policy. We're looking at a very serious situation in Southeast Asia. We are taking everything into account. I can't set up a model situation as to what would happen in the next 2 or 3 weeks. It would be impossible, nor could the State Department. But we're watching the situation closely. We hope it improves. Our intention ultimately is to improve our relations with Vietnam, just like we have done with China. But we have a very serious situation.
Do you feel our policy toward Vietnam has been consistent?
I think it's been utterly consistent. We have publicly and privately stated exactly the same thing to Vietnam, to China, to the Soviet Union. We are following that policy all the way through.
All right, thank you. Charlene?
What signals did we miss, Mr. McClear?
Well, the signals were many. Both the Vietnamese public attitude, which was by definition an official one in the days before the invasion when they knew what was coming. The signals they sent privately to the United States in trying to resume high-level negotiations on emotive issues such as the missing in actions, talks that were being arranged with the United Nations on the refugee situation, which Mr. Cannon has raised, and which the United Nations people tell me could result in an orderly and legal granting of exit visas, not only for the ethnic Chinese, but for reunion of families.
Mr. Cannon, what do you say to that?
We have taken all of these matters into account, but the really serious issues, and we have not missed any of those signals, but the really serious issues are presently with respect to the United States and Vietnam.
Mr. Cannon, can I ask you with respect, sir, how can you talk about wanting to have leverage on the situation when you don't recognize the country and when your only dealings in the area are through the enemy of that country, namely Peking?
There is no reason to suggest that normalization of relations with Vietnam would yield greater leverage on the part of the United States with Vietnam. We have been talking, if they're so interested in normalization of relations, one would hardly think they would have undertaken an action so brutal and massive as the attack on Cambodia.
Mr. McClear, what impact do you feel the failure of the United States to achieve normalization of relations with Vietnam would be?
I think the impact we've already seen. There is a great deal to the argument that the United States, in adopting a pro-Peking policy while allowing normalization talks with Vietnam to break down, may, I stress may, have encouraged China to act, and that China having acted, the United States, as Mr. Cannon still does, by linking China's invasion to that of the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, which is an argument that can be made in territorial but not moral terms, is again encouraging China to act elsewhere, perhaps in Cambodia, because the U.S. and the rest of the world has tended to ignore China's own role in supporting what Mr. Cannon calls a reprehensible regime.
I believe in the film you predicted, you said that China would risk the danger of a Holocaust ahead.
That is a possibility that everybody has virtually worried about since the invasion, that it could get out of hand, and therefore the question of normalization is one in the long-term interests of the United States, maybe the immediate interests of the United States and everybody else, and I do not see how there is any logic to a policy that proceeds on a negative, which says we can gain nothing by having normalization.
Briefly, Mr. Cannon?
I think that we're looking at a situation which we find exceedingly serious. We've been dealing with the Vietnamese now for 2 years, talking with them about normalization. That was a serious effort on the part of the United States. We talked publicly and privately, laid our cards on the table. When Vietnam began to act in the manner it did in November and December, with the massive invasion of Cambodia, with a very serious refugee situation, all we basically were saying was, we're going to review the bidding and we're going to review the timing and pace of these talks. That's what we were saying.
Hasn't the current situation...
We must go. I'm sorry, Michael Clear. Thank you very much. Jack Cannon, thank you, and good night, Charlene.
Good night, Jim.
We'll see you on Monday night. I'm Jim Malera. Thank you, and good night.
Good evening. Vietnam claimed today to have beaten off Chinese forces which invaded on Saturday, but there were also unconfirmed reports that the Chinese themselves were pulling back. From all three great power capitals, there was a note of caution. Deng Xiaoping, China's deputy premier, told a visitor that the action was intended, quote, to take care of a particular situation, and it will not be extended or expanded in any other way. The Soviet Union, while orchestrating a nationwide campaign of protest, said that its Vietnamese allies had the strength to take care of themselves. And in Washington, the U.S. government urged restraint by both Moscow and Peking. Hanoi Radio claimed that 12 Chinese battalions had been trounced, with 3,500 Chinese killed and 80 tanks destroyed. Diplomatic sources in Peking, quoted by Reuters news agency, said Chinese troops were believed to be pulling back. In Tokyo, the Japanese Foreign Ministry said the Chinese were withdrawing after penetrating 6 miles into Vietnam. The Chinese have said the action was to punish Vietnam for border harassment. But the Chinese invasion, coming on the heels of normalized relations with the United States and raising the possibility of Soviet retaliation, created puzzling, even nightmarish scenarios for the United States. Tonight, we attempt to sort them out. Like most of Washington, Jim Lehrer is snowed in tonight. We begin in New York with an analysis of the military situation. With us is Drew Middleton, veteran military affairs and foreign correspondent for the New York Times. Drew, what is the military situation now as you understand it?
I think that the Chinese, having made a considerable initial penetration, got to what might have been their stop line, agreed beforehand, 6 miles, 7 miles in, and have now halted. I don't believe the Hanoi estimates of Chinese losses. I think they're far too accurate to be correct. You're never able to say at the end of a battle you've knocked out 80 tanks or 39 tanks or destroyed 12 battalions. I think probably the Vietnamese forces along the frontier, which were mostly militia and frontier forces, probably suffered very heavily in the first attack. Evidently, the Chinese threw everything they had in artillery at them.
Yeah. Where were the principal attacks concentrated? We have these two places marked on the map.
That's just about it, northeast and northwest.
This dot being Hanoi here, the capital, yeah.
The one in the northwest, which came down the railroad and the Red River, probably could have been the most serious for the Vietnamese. Although, as far as I know, there was no contact between the Chinese invading forces and the Vietnamese main force, drawn up in an arc with 5 to 7 divisions around the city.
You mean drawn up to protect Hanoi like this, and the Chinese didn't come into contact with them as far as you know?
Except by air, no. They thought, apparently, the Vietnamese thought that these first 2 attacks might be holding attacks and the main drive would come along the coast. That had been a very difficult operation.
Is it true that a lot of the main force Vietnamese divisions are still in Cambodia, which they helped to take over?
The estimate is 100,000 troops. That doesn't mean they're the best troops at this phase of the war because they're going into a period of guerrilla operations. But the 5 to 7 divisions around Hanoi are good troops.
Would you think that there was any intention of striking as far south, which is about 100 miles from here and 140 from here, I believe, to the capital? Or was it just you believe that they had designed an original line and they just went in to occupy it?
I think they followed the Indian model to the extent they wanted to go in a certain area and teach a lesson. However, when you're dealing with totalitarian governments, you can never tell when it's going to go to their head.
How are we getting our information? I mean, are our spy satellites and things telling us what's going on there, or how are we knowing what's going on?
We really are knowing very little. We know very little. We're getting a good bit of stuff that's picked up, intercepts, of course.
You mean radio commands, overheard, things like that?
The spy satellites are good, but have been running into weather difficulties over that area, and of course over the possibly more important area on the Chinese-Soviet frontier. I think that on the whole, what we're getting is that the raw traffic is pretty complete.
Do you have any further information than I was able to give at the beginning on whether the Chinese have actually started to withdraw back to the border?
No verifiable evidence that they've started to withdraw. There have been rumors that they have. It would seem to me they would probably wait until they get some sign from the Vietnamese that they want to negotiate. If the Vietnamese don't negotiate, and the Chinese have put great emphasis on this, then they might stay there. That would give them an excuse.
What is the significance of the State Department report today that in the South China Sea here, somewhere level with where the old demilitarized zone used to be, there are a fleet of 12 Soviet ships.
Well, I don't think there's much military significance in that. You can't do much with ships 125 miles from the area of conflict. There's a Cresta-class cruiser and a Pieta frigate. But I think they're merely as a warning, and in a way an indirect warning to the Chinese that if things don't go well, the Russians may get Cam Bay, something they've been asking for 2 years.
Well, thank you. We'll come back. Now let's examine China's possible motives for the invasion. When Deng Xiaoping was in Washington at the end of January, during a 4-network television interview, Jim Lehrer asked whether China had any such intentions.
Mr. Vice Premier, does China plan to go to war over the Cambodia situation with Vietnam, which is backed by the Soviet Union?
这个问题我遇到多次的提问了。
Many people have asked me that question.
我可以告诉各位，这个中国人说话是算数的。
I can tell you all that what we Chinese people say counts.
中国任何行动都是经过深思熟虑的，都不会鲁莽从事的。
Any action taken by the Chinese is through careful consideration. We will not take any rash action.
中国对于这个无论是全球性的霸权主义或者地区性的霸权主义，都是采取坚定的立场，采取坚定的态度。
Whether it be global hegemonism or local hegemonism, China always adopts a firm position, a firm attitude.
同时，我还要告诉各位，越南侵略者除了明目张胆的用大量的军队进攻柬埔寨之外，同时在中越边境大量的制造边境事件，而且这个事件层出不穷的还在发展。
I can at the same time tell you that in addition to attacking Cambodia with great numbers of armed forces in a flagrant way, the Vietnamese are also creating a great number of boundary incidents along the Sino-Vietnamese border, and such border incidents are still further developing.
I take it then that the answer is yes, China is prepared to go to war over the Cambodia issue.
我们支持柬埔寨的立场是坚定不移的。
Our position of supporting Cambodia is firm and unshakable.
采取什么的步骤，采取需要怎么样对待这样的问题，我们还要研究。
But as to what measures we will adopt, as to how we shall deal with this problem, we'll still study it.
而这样的问题，不是由我们一个方面来决定。
And a question like that is not something to be decided by us alone.
So why did Deng carry out that implied threat? Richard Smith is managing editor of Newsweek magazine in New York. Until last year, he was bureau chief for the magazine in Hong Kong, the main China-watching position, and Asian editor for Newsweek International. Richard, what do you see as China's motives in this invasion?
Well, I think the motive of the border incidents really doesn't stand up. It's a punishment reaction based on a much broader set of frustrations. The Chinese supported the Vietnamese during the war with the United States. That relationship then quickly soured, resulting in a Vietnamese-Soviet friendship treaty. And I think the item that really pushed the Chinese into action was the invasion of Cambodia. Seen through the Chinese prism, this was simply too much to take and required punishment.
If it is true that they've stopped at 6 miles, and if it were even further true that they'd begun to withdraw, what could they have achieved?
Well, I think it has to be viewed through the Chinese prism, which sees the Soviet Union as the key adversary in this case. And I think the Chinese felt that they couldn't go on for this long without responding in some forceful way.
When their ally, the Cambodians, was overrun by the Soviets' ally.
Unfortunately for Peking, the Chinese picked the loser in the Indochina battle between Cambodia and Vietnam, and I think they felt that they had to do something to respond.
Some academic observers have been speculating that perhaps there was also a motive in Deng's mind of raising the spirit of nationalism in China and perhaps thereby strengthening support for his leadership and his policies. Is that a plausible motive to you?
I think it's plausible. Certainly any domestic regime operates on the basis of domestic motives, and I think it certainly will not hurt his position to rally the nationalist forces behind him. But I think in the long run, it's a very dangerous game to play if that's the game. Certainly the drive toward economic modernization and industrialization could be severely damaged if this invasion holds on for a long time. The shifting of military resources to fight a war requires great disruption in the Chinese economy.
And their apparently enormous commitment, witness all the move to the West and everything, to that economic modernization would argue against a prolonged military involvement.
I would think so. I basically follow the line of argument which suggests this is a brief punishing raid that is designed to go just so far to make a point that the Chinese are not willing to have a Cuban-style Soviet satellite on their borders, and then to pull back.
Mm-hmm. What kind of a message explicitly do you think they were sending the Soviet Union? That not to make, as Drew Middleton suggested, to carry their agreements with the Vietnamese to the point of putting a Soviet base in there or something as explicit as that?
I think the initial goal was to simply say, we won't sit still for the Cambodian invasion, we won't sit still for a very, very active Soviet presence in Vietnam. I think the implied message is that if that buildup continues, and if the Soviets, for example, take over Cam Bay and start docking ships there regularly, that Moscow and Hanoi can expect more and more of these retaliatory kind of measures.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's also been, there's also been speculation that one of the motives was to draw some of the troops, either all or some of the Vietnamese troops, out of Cambodia? Do you see that as a reasonable?
I think that's entirely possible, viewed from the Chinese perspective. I think, again, though, that if they were planning a brief encounter in North Vietnam, that they couldn't draw enough troops away from Cambodia to make much of a difference there. And you have to note two major differences between the Vietnamese invasion in Cambodia and the Chinese invasion of Vietnam. The Vietnamese basically moved into Cambodia and found relatively little resistance. They can hold their position there with a much lower level of military support. If the Chinese intend to stay in North Vietnam for any extended period of time, they're going to have to plan on encountering some very, very tough opposition.
Because they're up against one of the strongest armies in the world.
As we found out.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Now let's look at the Soviet reaction to the Vietnamese invasion and what it portends for the United States. Although no overt Russian military moves have been reported, it is known that they have something like 1 million men stationed along the borders with China. And an unofficial report from Moscow today said that the Soviet military had been placed on an alert, although the person who reported that also said that that was not unusual. Donald Zagoria is a leading academic analyst of relations between the Soviet Union and China and their respective relations with Vietnam. He's professor of government at Hunter College in New York. Professor Zagoria, there seemed to me to be two parts to the Soviet reaction. On the one hand, they were blowing up a big wind of propaganda, warning the Chinese to get out before it was too late. On the other hand, they were saying that while the Vietnamese don't stand alone, they were quite capable of taking care of themselves. How do you read that sort of two-toned reaction?
Before we talk about the Soviet reaction, I just want to make one addition to the Chinese motives, because I think it's crucial to understand the Soviet reaction. It seems to me that the Chinese look at the world today as one in which the Soviet Union is the leading expansionist power in Africa and Asia. And if you look at events in recent years, a good argument could be made along those lines. There have been two armed coups d'etats in Afghanistan and South Yemen last year, which brought pro-Soviet communist parties to power. There were near misses in Somalia and Sudan, which are run by two people who are very anti-Soviet. In both cases, the local leaders accused the Soviets or the Cubans of having been involved. The Soviets sent huge airlifts to Ethiopia and Angola of Cuban troops and weapons, which were decisive in helping the Ethiopian and Angolan communists to win their battles. This was then followed by a friendship treaty with Cambodia in November, with Vietnam, in November, which gave a green light to Vietnam to invade Cambodia. Now, the Chinese look upon this as a pattern of a large-scale Soviet effort to extend its influence via Cubans, via friendship treaties, via armed force, via proxies, all over Asia and Africa, and they've had some success in squeezing the Chinese out and in squeezing us out in many places. And I think, as part of this larger picture, the Chinese thought it was time to try to put a stop to this, to send a message to Moscow, which I think they've tried to do now. Now, as far as the Soviet reaction is concerned, I think that it's very interesting that alongside the big noises, they're saying the Vietnamese can take care of themselves. That suggests to me that in the short run, they've decided to let the Vietnamese take care of themselves on the grounds that the Chinese operation is going to be limited to 3 or 4 days or so, and then the Chinese will get out, and there won't be a larger problem. The larger problem for the Russians will come if the Chinese don't get out after 3 or 4 days, if the Chinese stay in these 6 miles of territory and say, we will not get out of Vietnam unless Vietnam gets out of Cambodia. At that point, if it's a protracted Chinese occupation of 6 miles of Vietnamese territory and demanding a quid pro quo from the Vietnamese, that will face the Russians with a very sticky problem.
What if they then decided to take a little piece of Chinese territory as a further bargaining counter?
Well, I think that Mr. Safire's column in this morning's New York Times is absolutely right. Could be the next step. And indeed, the Chinese were anticipating that next step. They told several of our people, or Deng Xiaoping told several of our people when he was here, that they were evacuating some cities in Xinjiang along the border. So clearly the Chinese have calculated that that may be a Russian reaction. I think they're prepared to tolerate such a reaction if they're going to follow this particular game plan, and then say, well, we still won't get out of Vietnamese territory unless the Vietnamese get out of Cambodia, and maybe at the end of all this there would be some sort of deal whereby everybody would get out of everybody else's territory, in which case the Chinese would have accomplished their objective of getting Vietnamese out of Cambodia.
Now, what does all this mean to the United States?
Well, it means that...
Are we just a spectator?
It means that it's a very, very risky chess game that is going on. I mean, everybody's trying to control their actions and to teach everybody else a lesson, but in the world of politics and the use of force, it could escalate, it could get out of control, and it has very serious implications for us, and I think we're doing what we ought to do, trying to discourage both the Chinese and the Russians from taking any further military action.
Why should they listen to us?
Well, I think we should make it clear to both of them, I'm assuming that we are, that their relations with us will suffer if military conflicts grow. We cannot expect to ratify SALT II, to have a détente relationship with the Soviet Union, much less to give it credits and economic aid at a time when the Soviets are engaging in military actions against China. And similarly, we should tell the Chinese we cannot expect to go into a trade relationship and technology and so on at a time that the Chinese are invading Vietnam. So I think we have considerable leverage with both of them.
Okay, let's just explore a bit further what the Soviet response might be. Drew Middleton, do you have any opinion on whether it's at all likely that the Soviets would respond with some kind of military retaliation in this case?
Yes, under certain conditions I do. As long as the Chinese stay in Vietnam, I think there's always the risk that the Russians will take some forceful reaction. I don't believe that the Chinese didn't have this on their mind when they went in there. It may have been the limiting factor as to how far they'd go. But I don't think, and contrary to what the professor says, I don't think that to get the Vietnamese out of Cambodia was one of their leading things. Their whole argument was based on the trouble along the frontier, not on Cambodia. They haven't raised that point yet. If they do, then we've got a new ball game. But to go back to the Soviets have got not quite 1 million troops. They haven't got that many. They've got about 44 divisions, say 500,000 troops, Air Force, and some missile bases. They've got enough to scare the Chinese, and they could go through any of those areas in the West and probably occupy a good segment of land. It wouldn't be worth much, but they would occupy it. Whether this would bring the pressure on the Chinese, I don't know. I doubt it. I agree there that the Chinese could take that.
Do you subscribe to the argument, Richard Smith, that if China was forced to save face, to do something as a result of Cambodia, the Russians would therefore be forced to do something over Vietnam?
I think they would certainly feel some pressures to do that, and certainly a prudent man would say there's a risk that the Soviets will take some retaliatory action. But I think if you look at the record of Soviet military intervention, direct military intervention, as opposed to adventurism through clients, they turn out to be fairly cautious people. And I think they are hoping right now that this invasion is coming to an end and that they will be able to get out of this situation without having to respond directly. And I agree that the comment about the self-sufficiency and the strength of the Vietnamese forces is a clear tip that they would like the Vietnamese to handle it themselves.
Well, to conclude, let's look a little more closely at what the consequences are for the United States, which must have Mr. Carter, in the middle of all his other foreign policy problems at the moment, somewhat concerned. First of all, what is this going to do to Mr. Carter's efforts to get the Congress to ratify his normalization of relations with China? A thing that was an idea that was based during Deng's visit on the idea that China was going to be peaceful and a good friend and a good trading partner. Is this going to make things more difficult for the president?
Yes, I think it will. I think some senators, some congressmen will argue that the Chinese can't be trusted. We can't trust them in Vietnam. Why should we trust them in Taiwan? We're playing their game. They come over here and then they engage in military action. It will certainly contribute to that kind of sentiment on the Hill.
Yeah, do you share that view?
I certainly do. I think this adds a whole new element to the debate over normalization. And it seems to me that one of the things that might come out of this is increased support for the Kennedy-Cranston proposal for a congressional resolution on the security of Taiwan. I think the Chinese have never really understood U.S. legislative politics, and I, for one, don't think it would be a bad lesson.
It's surprising, considering how few Americans understand it.
Yeah. But I think there would be some advantage in exposing them once again to the process of Congress at work. And,
Do you have a view on this, Drew? Or
well, I don't think an invasion of Taiwan by the Chinese is even a remote contingency at the moment. But it's not what is true, but what people believe is true that counts. And in this case, I think that the Senate and House will believe that having done this in Vietnam, they might turn around and do it in Taiwan. It's the most difficult of all military operations.
The Senate is going to have to ratify Mr. Carter's appointment of Leonard Woodcock as the first ambassador to Peking. Is this likely to have put up any real obstacle to that approval of his appointment, do you think?
I don't see how that would be effective. I think we ought to bear in mind here that there's one long-range basic thing at work that emerges from all of this. What we used to call the East-West conflict is now changing into what should best be called an East-East conflict in Asia. The most intense conflicts in Asia today, aside from that between North and South Korea, are between communist countries, Russia and China, China and Vietnam. Now, that's likely to last indefinitely. I think these are very deeply, historically, geopolitically rooted conflicts. They have some advantages and some disadvantages. The advantages is that so long as the communists are fighting themselves, all of them need good relations with Japan, with the United States, with this non-communist Southeast Asian countries, and so on. That's a great advantage for all of us. We should take advantage of, exploit that. The disadvantage is that these things could spill over into larger wars. And I think more of our policy should now be devoted to trying to dampen down, restrain these internecine communist conflicts.
I was just wondering if the practical political consequences in Washington are going to be in any way seriously to interfere or prevent Mr. Carter getting what he wants. For instance, the severance of the military pact with Taiwan, the approval of an ambassador to Peking, the SALT Treaty. Is this likely to jeopardize even further the ratification of a SALT Treaty by the Senate?
Well, I think there's a general feeling that SALT should be considered, must be considered indeed, in the general spectrum of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this brings in all the things we mentioned before, from Angola to Vietnam. I don't believe that SALT will be taken as simply as a treaty, nor should it be.
Something should be remembered also, and that's that SALT's in deep trouble right now.
Oh, exactly.
And I think anything that intensifies the debate about Soviet-American relations is going to cause it some more trouble.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. That's it for this evening. Thank you all for braving the heavy snows and coming and joining us tonight. That's all for tonight. We will be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.